So we're going to talk about the Cold War, and we're going to talk about a few other things related to that time period. And the Cold War is going to be something that's starting after World War II. It's going to be between the United States and the Soviet Union. And my generation grew up with the Cold War, as did, the boomers. The boomers grew up with the Cold War. The Cold War. Gen X, which is me, we grew up with the Cold War. And it kind of ended in 1989, 1991, that era where we had the fall of the Soviet Union and we had a lot of things that broke down. But anyway, when we talk about superpowers and we talk about how the United States came to the prominent position that we've been in all of your life and all of my life, that's where it started. It started after World War II. And the thing is, the Soviet Union had also gained a lot of power. So we're going to try to avoid having a hot war, having a war, boots on the ground, or heaven forbid, a nuclear war, by doing some other things. So let's talk about it. So we know that we had this thing going on for a long time that we call the Cold War, but historians disagree on the specific causes because that's what we do sometimes. We disagree about details. Now, that's where you get into interpretation of facts because you're allowed to have your own opinions. In some ways, you're allowed to have your own interpretations, but you can't have your own facts. Okay, that's a fact. That's just a truism, right? But what we agree upon as historians is the United States and the USSR, the Soviet Union, both contributed to this terrible atmosphere of hatred and anger and mistrust and all of the spy thrillers and all the things, watch old Cold War era movies, and it was just, we don't trust you, they don't trust us, we don't trust them, they don't trust us. And some people blame the Soviets more, that's generally the Americans, and some people blame the Americans more, that's generally the Soviets. So again, there's a lot of things going on that contribute to the Cold War. So it's a matter of sometimes where you want to lay more of the blame. So when it comes to the Cold War, the Soviet-American tensions, we have to talk about the fact that we had a wartime alliance with them after the communist revolution. The Soviet regime, remember in 1918, World War I, had left. They had gone and signed a separate peace with Germany, leaving the Western allies, of which we were a part of as the United States at that time, remember, fighting alone for a time. So you had the Soviets just kind of bowed out of World War I, remember, because they were having their own revolution at home. And Americans really dislike communism. We've talked about that a little bit, but there was a lot of mistrust between the two countries. The Soviets didn't believe in capitalism. They thought that capitalism was evil and the gap between rich and poor, and they had a lot of propaganda they used against us. For our part, the United States, they used a lot of propaganda against the Soviets, and they would show bread lines and try to scare Americans about communism. So much talk about communism when I was a kid. Watch, if you get a chance sometime, some of the good old Cold War era movies about spies, or go back to 1981, I think it was, War Games. Has to be the one with Matthew Broderick from 1981. I heard a rumor that they remade that. That's not right. That's not even going to be the same story. It couldn't be because it was very specific to that time. But anyway, the dislike of communism and the fact that it had actually become a real threat, remember, as of 1918 in Russia, and the fact that, remember, in the 20s, this was a thing that came up again, communist, and anarchist, and the scapegoats and all that. All of this is leading up to something. So what we had when we got to World War II, we're going to see a Soviet Union that we don't really want to be connected with. Like I was grousing and complaining in the World War II videos, if you listen to those, about how we were working with Joseph Stalin, for heaven's sake. But anyway, let me finish this part. So we had the Soviets leaving World War I and going on, to fight their own battles over there and become a communist dictatorship. And they started calling for world communist revolution. Now, that's not a new thing that they just made up. I mean, if you recall, Karl Marx believed that communism was a more evolved form of socialism, of Marxist socialism. And Karl Marx believed that the proletariat, meaning the working class, would eventually get so just disgusted and burned out with the overlords, the capitalists, the heads of the corporations or the factory owners or whatever, right? That the proletariat, the workers, would overthrow the owners and make one class, or well, actually eliminate class, social classes. So that would be communism, and that would be part of communism. And so that's not a new idea for the Soviet Union. I mean, they're basically touting what Marx had said all along. We need a worldwide communist revolution and to overthrow the capitalist countries. So they weren't at all interested in staying in their territory. Okay, they wanted to expand. And then you have Joseph Stalin who comes in. That's the one again I was complaining about. Anyway, Joseph Stalin is going to do these terrible purges, and I mentioned gulags also. And he's going to have anyone who he really is afraid of, or he doesn't trust them, his political enemies. And I have on the slide here, real or imagined, he would have them put to death. He would have them exterminated. He would have them locked away in gulags. And it was just terrible what Stalin did during that same, time where we have the Nazis in Germany. Now, the Nazis and the communists were not friends, right? Remember, the Nazis hated communists. Nazis did not like communism, and they did not like Marxist socialism. But look at that. 1939, if you recall, Joseph Stalin and Hitler had a short-lived agreement. It was that, remember where you have the comic on the other slideshow, you have the comic where Hitler is stabbing Stalin in the back, and I think in Stalin's hand, you have their agreement that was being broken, where they had this, pact between the two of them because they were both trying to stay out of each other's business for their own purposes. Okay. Russia did not want interference from Germany if they started taking over other territories. Germany did not want interference from Russia or the Soviet Union if they started taking over other territories. Anyway, Hitler invaded eventually Russia and is going to break that agreement. And 1939, he actually, though, invaded Poland and again gave us our September 1st, 1939 being sort of the official beginning of World War II, I'm sorry, World War II. Too many wars I'm talking about lately. When some people blame the Soviets more, what are they saying? Okay. What do the people say who blame the United States more? Okay, so here's what's going on. All right. The Soviets, of course, they had hostility toward the United States the way that we had hostility toward them because of communism and because of leaving in World War I and all of the ideas that they had about world takeover by communism. Now, the Soviets didn't really like the United States for other reasons. They opposed what they viewed to be our interference at the end of World War I, okay? Because the United States obviously opposed the Russian communist revolution, which overthrew the Russian Empire in 1917, and we sent troops at the end of World War I to Russia. Now, the Soviets believed it was to overthrow their government. So they don't trust us, first of all, for those things. Now, the West is going to exclude the Soviet Union after World War I because they were not having free elections. Okay, of course they're not. I mean, it's a communist dictatorship. So the Soviet Union was not allowed to join the League of Nations. So they were angry about that. Now, that wasn't just at the United States because we never joined the League of Nations. Remember, we proposed it, but we didn't join it. But that was a thing where the Western countries had purposefully left out the Soviets. Now, another thing I've mentioned before, the United States refers to have diplomatic relations at all with the Soviet government, and that means that they remember when we talked about Theodore Roosevelt's revolution in Panama, and I told you that until a country of some legitimacy recognizes a new country, then it's not going to be seen as legitimate necessarily in the eyes of some of the world. So the United States refused to recognize diplomatically and give, I guess, the Soviet government the legitimacy that they desired until 1933. Okay, so we just basically ignored them as much as we could and pretended like we didn't have to deal with them, and we just didn't diplomatically. Now, most of the Russians were raised, like I said, like the people of my generation and the ones, the older ones, the ones right above my generation, were raised, the Russians, I'm sure, just like we were. The Russians dislike capitalism as much as we dislike communism, and I'm sure they got that taught to them from the time they were kids, too. So, anyway, during World War II, rather, there was a common enemy, and this is why they got together, the United States and the Soviet Union in World War II, because Hitler had betrayed Stalin. Now, if Hitler had held to that neutrality agreement, if he had held to the agreement with Stalin and not invaded Russia, I wonder, right? Wonder if Stalin would have gotten involved in World War II. Huh, right? So that's why we were able to work with the Soviets during World War II. It was because we were fighting against the Nazis. And that's why the Cold War is going to start after World War II, because we no longer have a common enemy. And so we start looking, toward the Soviet Union, they start looking toward the United States, and neither one of us likes what we see, and neither one of us trusts the other. So the Yalta Agreement, if you recall, we mentioned Yalta had divided Germany and Berlin into occupied zones with a divided Berlin. Now this is going to be a big, big deal, because remember, they talked about the Allies are going to occupy Germany. Germany had been the belligerent in both world wars. So the Allies are going to occupy Germany. Now, the thing is, you've got Berlin. Berlin's the capital of Germany. So how did they plan to divide the capital? Okay, well, that one is a little bit more difficult to do without a map. So if you look at the map, you'll see the territories there that had originally been agreed upon. We have the British, the French, and the American territories of Germany that are going to be occupied. And then you see over there in the purple, you're going to see that's the territory that I think the Americans had gotten out of recently. I think the Americans had withdrawn. I think that was in July of 1945. And then you're going to see, if you look a little bit above the E in Soviet, in that red part, you're going to see the city of Berlin. Okay, and that's the capital. And so the idea originally is you're going to have the Allies carving up Germany, something like this. Well, dividing Berlin, though, that's going to be the really tricky part. Because if you look very carefully, you'll notice something. The city of Berlin is absolutely, inarguably, in Soviet territory. So is that going to be fair for the Allies to say, wait, Joseph Stalin, we don't think you should have the city of Berlin. We're going to need to have half of it. Well, Stalin's not going to really like that. And to be fair to Stalin, give the devil his due. I mean, again, it's right inside of Soviet territory. It really literally is. So at the Potsdam Conference, Truman had accepted the border that the Soviets had established, and the policy that Harry S. Truman's going to have is going to be containment. So containment means we're going to stop it from spreading. It's clear that the Soviets are going to have their territory, and there's going to be, even maybe a little bit more territory that they might gain right, close to them, maybe, but let's see if we can stop it. Think of it like the virus. Think communism is the virus, right? So you want to stop it before it spreads. And that was the Truman Doctrine, really. So again, the first action under the policy of containment was the Truman Doctrine, which is the policy of the United States is to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities with or by outside pressure. Okay, basically. So the United States is going to support people who are trying not to be taken over, right, by armed minorities. That would be supposedly, of course, the communists that were trying to have a revolution in your country. And then with or by outside pressure, well, communists, that's the main thing. And that, it was worded so it could be used if it needed to be used against something other than communism. But the containment policy, the Truman Doctrine, was specifically written at a time when we were talking about the spread of communism from Soviet Russia. So we see some things going on in Turkey. We have Russia trying to get some territory from Turkey. Remember, Turkey is right to the south of Russia. And then we're having a civil war in Greece, where the Greek communists are fighting to gain control of the government. So the Greek Civil War, I mean, this along with what was happening over in Turkey was going to be the basis for our first use of the Truman Doctrine, our policy of containment. So we've got the Communist Party over in Greece that had, I don't know, the Communist Party in Greece they had a particular name, but they did have a military, right? The Communist Party had a military, if you could imagine that. And they're going to have a military for a while. And the Soviets didn't want to get involved, but it was fighting for the same cause. It was fighting for communism. So from 1946 to 1949, we're going to have a civil war going on between the government of Greece and the Communist Party. Now, again, the thing about Turkey was basically, Russia was trying to control some of the Turkish territory. So we're going to see our first application here again in Greece and in Turkey, trying to stop the spread of communism. So again, keep in mind, the Truman Doctrine means that we wanted to, and we were vowing to help people who wanted to remain free. And we've talked a lot about that. We talked about that with the Philippines. We talked about that several times during the course of the semester in different contexts. But in this particular case, Harry S. Truman wants to make sure that Turkey and Greece are going to get help because he told, I guess he made several pleas with Congress and so on, but he said that if Greece and Turkey did not get help, then they would become communist. And if Turkey and Greece both fell to communism, it would continue to spread. Because see, what part of Russia's policy or Soviet policy was they wanted to have several communist states between them and the West, all right? So that would put some little bit of distance in between the Soviet Union and the West. And what would be better here, you start with places like Greece and Turkey. Now, it turns out that what we do is we end up sending millions of dollars in American money to help both Greece and Turkey. And eventually this is going to pay off because when NATO is formed, which is going to be a little bit later, we're going to talk about NATO, a military alliance. But when NATO is formed, Greece and Turkey are going to join NATO to guarantee that they would have the protection of the Western nations behind them. Okay, so what about this Berlin airlift then? This all this stuff's happening, and what does it mean? Well, the United States, we're trying to look forward, and we're trying to strengthen our military in Western Europe. How are we going to go about that? Well, we have to take into account a reconstructed, rebuilt Germany. And remember, we talked about having, and the map I showed you before, we talked about having these occupation zones, 3 Western occupation zones. And Harry Truman's going to reach an agreement with England and France to actually merge all of the Western zones of occupation into a new West German Republic, which would include the United States, the French, and the British sectors of, as I mentioned before, Berlin. As I said, Berlin was inside, completely inside, the Soviet zone. Okay, remember, Soviets were on our side in World War II. So, I mean, what are we doing? We're merging the Western zones of occupation, and then we're asking for the city of Berlin, which is in Soviet territory. Well, of course, Stalin is not going to accept that just lightly and say, okay, yeah, sure, of course, however you're going to do this, that's fine. Well, he doesn't do that, but he also had other reasons to be worried because Yugoslavia was getting aid from the United States as part of the containment policy to prevent the spread of communism, and he was facing the fact that Yugoslavia was not going to be allied with Russia anymore. So Stalin's got a lot to think about. What's he going to do? So then when the Allies join Germany, join their 3 parts of their Western occupation into the Federal Republic of Germany, you're going to find that in Berlin, there's going to be a terrible crisis. Okay. And in the city of Berlin, since it came right down to it, you did not want to be in East Germany. See, if you look at the map, you have West Germany and East Germany, and I grew up with that until I was 23, 24 years old. That's what we had. We had West Germany, we had East Germany. And I want you to take a look at that because the next slide we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But notice over there we have the Allied area and we have the Soviet area. But again, the entire city of Berlin is within Soviet territory, which was what always confused me when I was younger and just learning about this stuff. But you're going to see pretty early on, at first, you're going to have citizens in East Germany, in what became the Soviet-controlled territory of the city of Berlin. You're going to have this happening in a smaller way, but the citizens had begun to cross over to West Germany, or if they were in Berlin, to West Berlin, to try to protect themselves from what was going on, because things were getting bad in the eastern parts. And Russia started to get really aggressive, and they were very concerned with reclaiming the western part of Berlin. So let's look at some of that, and we're going to look at some of the problems, because at some point then the Soviets are going to decide that they want all of the city of Berlin, and there's no way that they want to give it up. So this is where we end up with the Berlin airlift, also known sometimes as the Berlin blockade, in 1948, when the Russians are going to surround West Berlin to try to make the Allied soldiers there surrender. Because if they sealed off everything, if they sealed off railroads and any way they could get over into the western part of Berlin, if they effectively cut off this part of Berlin from the western section of Germany, then the Allied soldiers there would have to surrender. Okay, how would they get food? How would they be able to get any kind of fuel? How would they get any supplies? So this is where we have the amazing Berlin airlift. So again, what's happened is the Russians are not happy, and they're going to proclaim at some point that there's going to be no government relations anymore between the Soviet Union and the other, allies, the other Russia's former allies, but the other allies from World War II. So things get worse. 1948, as I said, Stalin's going to put the tight blockade around the western parts of Berlin. And again, if Germany is going to be divided, the Western government's going to have to leave. Again, you're going to have to surrender because the blockade around the western sections of Berlin meant that the soldiers in there would not have access to anything. So Truman says, you know what? No, we're not going to do this. We're going to find a way around it. Now, Truman did not want to go back to war. I mean, absolutely not. It's not been that long since World War II ended. So Truman ordered this airlift to supply the city with food and fuel and supplies for more than 10 months, keeping 2 million people alive, which is amazing. 2.5 million tons of material are going to be dropped in there. Cargo planes are going to be dropping supplies into West Germany 24 hours a day for that period. Now, Russia, the Soviets tried to say, well, we're just doing some road work and construction. Nobody believed them. And we basically ended up declaring that, guess what? The Allies are not leaving Berlin. We're going to stay. And so everything gets even more intensified. What ends up happening is, of course, the resolve of West Berlin and the Allies becomes a symbol of the entire Western world's resolve to resist the expansion of communism. So what was happening in the city of Berlin is going to make it more important that we make sure that we consolidate our alliance between the United States and the Western European countries, and it had been unofficial up to this point. So in April of 1949, 12 nations are going to sign this agreement establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, okay, NATO. And basically, this is where we have declared that an armed attack against any of the NATO countries or nations is going to be considered an attack against all. Remember the system of alliances that was one of the four causes of World War I? This is a big old alliance is what this is. Remember, Greece and Turkey are going to join NATO as well for their protection. So NATO countries agreed to maintain a standing military force in Europe to defend against the Soviet invasion. Okay, so we're going to have military in Europe to this day, correct? If any of you have been in the military, you've had family members in the military. Sometimes they're sent to Germany. That back in the 80s, that was a really, really big place where they would send a lot of my friends' fathers and parents. But NATO countries are going to have a standing military to defend against Soviet invasion. So the Senate, the United States just knocks that through really quickly. And you're going to find that some of these countries that had not gotten along all that well are now going to be allies officially with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, the Soviets, for their part, they're angry and they need an alliance of their own. So in 1955, they're able to put together something called the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is going to basically bring together several of those countries, some in the Balkans, like Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, some of those, Czechoslovakia, which has been split now, as have some of these others. But anyway, you're going to have several of those countries coming together. And remember, Yugoslavia had split from the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia had to also worry about, on one side of them, they had the Warsaw Pact, but on the other side of them, they had to be concerned about the West. So poor Yugoslavia was sort of in a rough spot there for a long time. But the Warsaw Pact is going to be their answer in the East to NATO. So you have to remember, Harry Truman came into the presidency upon the death of FDR in 1945, April, and he believed that the American people liked the New Deal, which they did for the most part, of course they did. And he's going to propose all kinds of measures in 1948 as he's running on his own for election. And you know what? He introduces the first civil rights bill of the century in 1948. Now, what we see is that Harry Truman was a Democrat. FDR was a Democrat. Truman is going to be up against a Republican-controlled Congress. Now, we see by the time we get to World War II and by 1948, I mean, we see that in some of these issues, the Republicans and Democrats really have switched. And one of those issues is going to be civil rights. Okay, the Democrats have taken over fighting for civil rights for especially, for African American community by this time, very, very clearly. And the Republicans have started to become a lot more conservative and not supporting things like civil rights. So the Republican controlled Congress is not going to vote for all of these things, including that civil rights bill. You know what happens? We see all the time, we see it today. Okay, you have presidents that are running for re-election who bring up issue after issue, even knowing that they're not going to, that it's going to get defeated. Or you even see Speaker of the House, or you see the Senate Majority Leader, other powerful politicians who are up for re-election at certain times. They'll bring up all of these issues, and they know that some of these issues are not going to pass because the opposing party is not going to vote for them. But what they're doing is they're building up campaign issues for the fall. Truman's not all that popular as far as people liking him. People really loved FDR. But a lot of Democrats weren't crazy about Truman, and they weren't really sure what else to do. So the election of 1948 is going to be one of those, that's going to be one of those really wild ones. 1948 is going to be one, 1968 is going to be one, the year 2000 is going to be one. We've got lots of them. But this election, he was building on campaign issues that he could say right up coming to the election. He could say, look, man, I tried to get this and this and this passed. Hey, I'm all for the civil rights bill. I tried to get it passed. I introduced it, but the Republicans wouldn't do it. So he was trying to get the people to see that he was a lot like FDR. But again, it's not going to really work with the Democrats. And we're going to have a division in the party that, well, this is, again, one. Oh, the Democrats and the Republicans, such strange creatures they are. Remember, I've talked about a lot about the solid South, okay? Solid South used to mean that the South is going to vote Democrat for a long time. South's Democrat. Okay, remember, Democrats in the beginning, when we're talking in the beginning of this class and we talk about the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Democrats were the ones who wanted to continue slavery, and then the Democrats were the ones who wanted things to go a lot more slowly when it comes to equality for African Americans. Well, I mean, the South today, if we look at it in the year 2020, when I'm recording this, the South has pretty much, in a large part, gone Republican. Now, if that doesn't show you the difference in the two parties and how they switched, I mean, that's one of the clear markers. So one thing we have going on here in the Democrat Party in 1948 is the Southern Democrats, who are always going to be more conservative in general, they're going to form something called the Dixiecrats with Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. Yikes, okay? Why do I say yikes? Oh, well, okay, here's what's happening. Well, Strom Thurmond is going to run on the party, or the party, the Dixiecrats, but he's going to run on the platform of segregation. Okay, no, we don't want to segregate schools. No, we don't want blacks and whites to mix. Of course, we don't want blacks and whites to mix. I mean, the platform of the Dixiecrats, that's what it relies on. That's what it stands on. And the way they framed it was the same way the Southerners framed secession during the Civil War. States' rights, okay? They sometimes called themselves the States' Rights Democratic Party. So, what they wanted was they wanted to, as I said, forbid the races from mixing. They also, though, wanted to make sure that state and local laws were allowed to remain. Okay, if Alabama or Mississippi or wherever, if they wanted to continue to keep blacks and whites separate, then the Dixiecrats said, by golly, they should be allowed to do that. Now, they also wanted to allow the white supremacy that had been going on in the region since, Civil War and before. They wanted to allow that to continue. So again, they're going to frame all of this in the light of states' rights, and also they framed it as in being, well, loyal, patriotic Americans who are opposed to authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And okay, right? They ended up becoming a third party, and they're going to end up going away after the 1948 election. They had kind of, I guess, seen their time and come and gone. But Strom Thurmond, there you go. Now, the Democrats, the actual party, is going to run, of course, the incumbent president, Harry Truman. And then we have Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey is the Republican candidate. He had actually run before in 1944. I don't know why. I mean, why did he think he could beat FDR in 1944? I mean, it was during wartime, and arguably World War II was what really pulled us out of the Great Depression, along with FDR and all. I don't know how Thomas Dewey thought he could win. That was probably a very bad time for him to try to run, but he had lost to FDR. Now, notably, though, Dewey had originally wanted the guy who eventually became Chief Justice, Earl Warren of the Supreme Court. He'd eventually wanted Warren as his vice presidential candidate, but he had settled for someone else, because of his advisors. But that's kind of a little trivia because we're going to talk about the Warren Court a little bit later. But anyway, Thomas Dewey had been governor of New York. Now, he's running really against Truman, because nobody expects a lot out of the Dixiecrats. It's a third party, and that just, the story of third parties in the United States. So Truman went on this whistle-stop train tour. Again, getting out there and looking people in the eye. This is going to be a big deal even today. So he was criticizing this do-nothing Republican Congress. Just like I told you, he had been bringing up things to use in this campaign. He had been bringing up campaign ideas every time he would go to Congress, or every time he would send something to Congress, every time he would ask for a new bill that had anything to do with civil rights or anything that he knew that the Republican Congress would kick out. Truman was able to have one more way of criticizing the Republican Congress for not doing anything. Hey, look, they're against making progress. And so at one of these whistle stops, when Truman was out speaking, somebody very famously yelled, "Give them hell, Harry!" And that sort of became his slogan. I mean, I think it's cool that it sort of became an unofficial slogan, but I think it's really funny because Truman actually replied to this guy who had yelled out in the audience, and he had said something to the effect of, "I don't give them hell, I just tell them the truth and they think it's hell." Something like that, or tell the truth about them, something political. But yeah, that was something that happened on the Whistle Stop tour, which I think is pretty interesting. There's just something about that contact with the people. Again, Woodrow Wilson did the same thing, trying to get eyeball to eyeball contact with the American people to convince them, in this case, Truman's case, that he was the right man. He could continue FDR's legacy. Politics is never easy, but poor Harry Truman. We also had some other things going on. You may remember way back, we talked about Ulysses S. Grant, and we talked about he could have run as a famous general right after the Civil War. He could have run as either a Democrat or Republican. He would have probably got the presidency. He ran as a Republican because he thought the people were accepting the Republican ideas of Reconstruction better than they were accepting the Democrats' ideas. Here we have Dwight David Eisenhower, okay, General Eisenhower, who I told you before, there's some parallels with him and Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, so we have a lot of liberal Democrats who don't want to leave the party and they don't like Truman. So what do they want to do? Well, they're looking for somebody else. And some of them went looking and seeking and asking the war hero, General Eisenhower, to become the candidate. Now that's unusual. You don't see a lot of dumping of an incumbent sitting president by their own party. You don't see a lot of that. But after Eisenhower said no, then the liberal group of the Democrats decided to go ahead and accept Truman for the sake of the party as the official candidate. Famous iconic picture of the winner of the election of 1948, Harry S. Truman, holding up the Chicago Daily Tribune and their headline that says Dewey defeats Truman. What was that? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on that caused that headline, but the fact that it was put out before even a lot of the states had reported, and you're going to see that the paper had relied on someone who was a political analyst, and he had an uncanny knack for predicting the winner of presidential elections. So they asked him, and they thought, well, Dewey's going to win. So they went ahead and printed out that headline, and there was something, I don't even know what it was. There was some reason also that the paper had to be put out earlier than usual. Anyway, it was just a perfect mess right there. And when Truman was passing through, he ends up grabbing a copy of this paper, and he's going to hold up the early edition, and the photographers take the famous picture. And there's a couple of them, but supposedly, Truman smiled at one of them and said, "That ain't the way I heard it." Now, you guys might not get that, but I do. Okay, this is 1948, and I love 1940s stuff. There was a radio show called Fibber McGee and Molly that had been on since the 30s. And there was a character in Fibber McGee and Molly that would, the character, the lead character, Fibber McGee, right? He would tell some kind of joke or story or something, and there was an old man, and the old man would always say, "That ain't the way I heard it." So that was undoubtedly a take, like a pop cultural take on Fibber McGee and Molly because of the time. But anyway, iconic photograph. And there's a couple different ones that float around out there from different photographers, slightly different angles and so on. But I love that because you just can't put out the news before you actually know the news, right, guys? I've mentioned to you before that the 50s and the 20s are very much in some ways mirrors of each other. They're very much there's so many parallels in the 50s and the 20s, from the labor unions to just all these other things that we've talked about, so many things. From the slide, what number are we on? Number 15. We're going to talk about another kind of parallel. Okay. Communism, 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 communism. Okay. Again, 1920s, communism had been kind of a big issue there for a while. We mentioned that earlier, but it's going to come up again in the 50s. And we call this McCarthyism because of the senator who brought it out to the public eye, and he's going to be on TV all the time, causing a panic, this Red Scare. Remember, the 20s had a Red Scare as well. He's going to cause another Red Scare, okay? Now, Joe McCarthy is a junior senator from Wisconsin, and apparently he wants to be famous. So he knows that the scapegoat of the moment is communist, right? And communism is so feared at 1940s and 1950s. February 1950, he's making a speech to the Republican Women's, whatever it was, one of the women's clubs in West Virginia. I think it was Wheeling, West Virginia, and he waves a piece of paper that says, "I have the names of over 200 communists in the State Department." Okay, cool, Joe. Later on, he made that speech again and he said, 57 card carrying communists. Then, when he went before the Senate, he said 81. He had no evidence, but boy, did he cause a red scare again. What was so interesting about this is that no person in the United States of comparable stature, a U.S. senator, had ever made such a claim against the government. Okay, we've got secret communists planted everywhere. So he's accusing all sorts of agencies in the all the government departments, and he's just accusing all sorts of people, and he has nothing. He never produces any solid evidence that not even one federal employee had communist ties. And he's going to be, like I said, he's going to be on TV conducting all of these investigations and asking people tons of questions, and it's really a sideshow. Now, as what always happens, there's always going to be a group that's going to criticize you, and there's always going to be a group that's going to agree with you no matter what you say or what you do. So there's a group that starts to embrace him as being patriotic, and he's fearless because he's assaulting the establishment. Huh. Kind of sounds familiar sometimes. That repeats itself sometimes, right? Okay, repeats itself. So you're going to have this group that really looks up to him because he's taking on the government. And in this case, it's Republicans that are rallying around Joe McCarthy. And it turns out, he had no evidence, he produced nothing, and they're going to support him. As he says, Democrats have been responsible for 20 years of treason. Okay, of course, going back to FDR and so on. So, wow. Joe McCarthy. That's a moment in American history for sure that we don't want to relive. By the mid 50s, I mean, people had kind of tired of him, and his ratings kind of fell. By 1954, it was late in the year that the Senate voted to censure Senator McCarthy. Now, I've heard that word used recently about things, in terms of before impeachment or just other things. It's been brought up in the political environment that we live in today many times. But a censure is going to be a formal and public condemnation of an individual. Okay, usually a member of your own group. So that would be like the Senate. The senators can vote to censure, condemn a member of their group. So that's what they did. They voted to censure Senator McCarthy, and this is going to make him one of the very few that ever had that. And I'm not going to say honor because it's not, but he's going to continue to try to accuse people of communism until he died. Now, what we know is that he dies about 3 years later, and he's only 48 years old. To me, he always looks older than 48 in all the pictures I've ever seen of him. But you're going to see McCarthy dying in 1957, and they're not really sure what was wrong with him. Now, he had just 3 years before that, he had lost popularity, and he had become more kind of infamous for being famous for a bad reason in terms of his communist witch hunt that never proved anything. But when he dies, it was 3 years after he had lost that popularity. And so we think that, even after he was censured, he's going to still remain as a senator for a couple years, but he knows that he has really no support. And the press did not give him the time of day anymore. And so McCarthyism was not gaining him the attention that he wanted. And we believe that McCarthy, after the censure, we think, from people who knew him and some biographies that were written, and there's actually a couple of really good biographies about Joe McCarthy, but they believe that he had been abusing alcohol for quite a long time, and he ended up with cirrhosis of the liver, they think. Okay, now they knew that he had been drinking, like I said, for a long time. There were times that they said in one of the biographies that I've seen of him, they said that he was actually drunk sometimes when he was in the Senate acting as a senator. So anyway, McCarthy also, because probably the pain that he was in from maybe from the cirrhosis, I don't know, but they think he had also become addicted to morphine, and that was in another biography that I saw. And morphine is, of course, something that we know. I mean, it's a really strong pain reliever, much more than that, really, and it's very, very addictive. So anyway, we have McCarthy dying again, 48, and they didn't know what to put on his death certificate. They didn't put cirrhosis, but they did put hepatitis, which was hinting at, of course, something wrong with the liver. And they put acute cause unknown. So anyway, he's going to be someone who's going to be relegated to the infamy pile of history in the United States. So we've got to talk about Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers, but first I want to call your attention to HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, this is something that comes up as a result of the whole atmosphere of the time, McCarthyism and all that. And HUAC, I did a whole study on that when I was in graduate school about HUAC and the what did they call it? The Inquisition in Hollywood. That was one of the really good books about it. The Inquisition in Hollywood. I had to think about it for a minute. It's in my office out at school, way up high, I think, on my bookcase. But anyway, this is a great book that I used as part of my research on HUAC. And what HUAC did was they were accusing openly, trying to find communists in Hollywood for one thing, and they got rid of a lot of directors, got them blackballed from Hollywood. They were never going to work again, a lot of actors and so on. So HUAC is really important in pop culture in some ways too, because it hit hard close to home when they started to go after some of the bigger stars of the time. And they're going to go after people like Charlie Chaplin. We've talked about Charlie Chaplin a little bit, and they're going to go after a lot of big names that become just, they have to leave the country to go find work, basically. And we have something called the Hollywood 10. Hollywood 10, these were 10 people that were going to be cited for contempt of Congress and actually blacklisted for refusing to answer any questions about their possible involvement as communist. And these are going to be people, screenwriters and directors and so on. And there's one named Dalton Trumbo. Now, Dalton Trumbo was an American screenwriter who also wrote, he wrote some really famous movies, really great movies, including, I always think of Spartacus. That was a very famous one. And Roman Holiday, that was a great movie. But Dalton Trumbo is also going to write a novel that was really disturbing. And I read that. I don't even remember when I read that. I'm sure it was probably back, I don't know, when I was maybe in my 20s or something. But I remember Trumbo's book, Johnny Got His Gun, was one of the strangest, I guess, and scariest books I'd ever read. He wrote that in 1939, 1938, somewhere back there. And it was a story about a guy who was in war, and he got, well, he got so severely injured. I mean, I think he was blown up, something. There was some kind of a bomb that had gone off or something in the war. And he pretty much lost most of himself, right? He lost like all of his limbs and I think even his face. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, yeah, any of this kind of stuff. And it was just terrifying. It was meant to be written as an anti-war novel. Because the problem with this is this guy, that whoever he was, it was well, it was written in 1939, so it was about okay, it was written about World War One. But anyway, whoever the main character is, whatever his name was, I mean, imagine he's got no arms and legs, and he's lost his eyes and ears, and even if I remember correctly, I mean, even his mouth, like his teeth and stuff. So the problem is he can still think and he can still understand what's going on. And it's really terrifying to think about being in a position where you can't move, where you can't really do much of anything, but you can think. And anyway, I mean, if you get a chance to read that book, it's very, very disturbing. But anyway, Dalton Trumbo he was a great screenwriter in Hollywood who got blacklisted, and he became one of what they called the Hollywood 10. Again, these are the guys that, that stood up. I don't know. I think there were a couple of women in there. I don't remember, honestly. There might not have been. I don't remember. But anyway, they're going to stand up and say, rely on freedom of speech. So HUAC is going to do a lot of things. That was, again, the House Un-American Activities Committee. And it's finally going to go away. It's going to lose popularity in the late 50s, just like McCarthyism had done. But anyway, the story here that comes out is we have this guy, Alger Hiss. Now, he had been former State Department official, and he's accused of being a communist sympathizer. Turns out Whittaker Chambers, who actually had been a spy for the Russians, for Soviet Union, Russia, right? He is going to turn and he's going to call names, tell names. He's going to name names, whatever the expression is. And so Whittaker Chambers is going to testify in front of HUAC, and he's going to say, "Hey, Alger Hiss, this is a guy. He was a communist." Now, he says that Alger Hiss also was a spy. Whittaker Chambers produces some documents. He said that Hiss had given him back in the 30s, and the documents were hidden in Chambers' farm in a pumpkin. So that's where we get the thing about the pumpkin papers. Now, the big thing about this is you need to know who Whittaker Chambers is. He actually was a former communist, a spy, no less, and he turned in Alger Hiss and some others as well. And he relies on some of these papers, these documents that were hidden in a pumpkin. Now, in 1948, Alger Hiss is going to be charged with perjury because he denied ever being a communist and being a spy and all of that. But Alger Hiss is going to be convicted in 1950, and this is where we're going to see the beginnings of a guy. I wish we had time to talk about more if we could have made it, a little further this semester. But you're going to see rather Richard Nixon, who becomes president in 1968, causing a lot of corruption in the 1970s through Watergate. But Richard Nixon's going to be a representative in California, and he's going to get, the first time really, he's going to get his national platform. So Alger Hiss, poor old Alger Hiss, again, he's going to be convicted of perjury, and for the rest of his life, he said he was innocent, and he ended up, I think, serving maybe about 3 years in prison. So anyway, that's another, the whole Red Scare, the whole communist thing's another really interesting part of the 1950s. We're going to change gears completely here and go jump over here into a little bit of my favorite, pop culture, just for a second. Now, the 1950s television, I really like a lot of this. I grew up watching a lot of the old reruns of some of these shows. I mean, of the three that I've got up there, Ozzie and Harriet, Father Knows Best, and Leave It to Beaver. Leave It to Beaver was actually a really pretty good show. I mean, I watched every episode of it several times when I was growing up. I would see it in reruns. Gosh, it used to be on TV all the time, at any time of day almost you could find it. But that was actually a pretty well produced, pretty good show in my opinion. Ozzie and Harriet, I never really cared for. They had a radio show before that. Father Knows Best, it also came from a radio show. And I've listened to the radio show, I've watched the TV show, and I actually really prefer the radio show of Father Knows Best. But anyway, as far as the 1950s television goes, Leave It to Beaver, I think, is going to make maybe more episodes in the 1960s than it does in the 50s, but it does start in the 1950s. But what we see is, do we see the reflection of the real world? The answer is no, not in the United States. We've got all these white families, mom, dad, couple kids, two or three kids, and wow, you don't really see a lot of minorities. And when you do see them, they're usually just caricatures. They're some kind of funny role or some kind of, way off the wall role. And usually there's something like a maid or somebody that is working for a white man or a white family. So is that reflective of what's going on in the 1950s? No, absolutely not, because the 1950s, this is where we really see the civil rights movement start. And there's one episode I remember of Leave It to Beaver where you do have someone who is not just a, regular white kid on there. He actually has a friend who is Mexican. Oh, wow. His name was, I can't remember what the kid's name was. I've seen these episodes probably 100 times, but he had a kid who he brought home. It was his friend. He couldn't speak English. And so Beaver asked, for him to come over and play, and they were trying to communicate like kids will do. But then his brother, Beaver's brother, the older boy there on the PowerPoint over on the right, the older kid, he had a best friend named Eddie Haskell, who was a troublemaker. So Beaver was talking to the little boy, trying to communicate with him, and Eddie Haskell's like, "Oh, I know Spanish. Here, let me tell you, what do you want to say to him?" And so Beaver said, "Well, I want to tell him what a great friend he is, and I'm glad he came to visit," or something like that. And so Eddie Haskell tells him, "Here, say this." And he has Beaver memorize it. Go tell him this. Go tell him this. And so Beaver said, "Okay, now it says that he's a great friend," or whatever, right? Eddie's like, "Oh yeah, of course, of course." So Beaver goes in there and he says whatever that bad kid, the troublemaker, had told him to say to the little Mexican boy who can only speak Spanish. And the little boy starts crying, and I think he wants to go home and whatever. And it turns out that Eddie Haskell had told Beaver to tell the little boy something like, "Your face looks like a pig," or something ridiculous. And that's the kind of comedy that these shows had. They didn't really, dive deep into problems, and especially Ozzie and Harriet. That was the most vanilla, boring show, and in my opinion, again, the radio show and the TV show, just so boring. They were a real family, though. Ozzie and Harriet Nelson were married, and their sons, the boy on the left was Ricky Nelson. He was one of the early teen idols. And then on the right was David Nelson. And anyway, Father Knows Best. I mean, all three of these, they're gonna have the idea that the father knows best. I mean, to be really cliche and read the title of the show. But the idea is, again, nuclear family. The idea is the man's the breadwinner, the woman's taking care of the home. June Cleaver on Leave It to Beaver, she would clean, in her pearls. You can see a little bit of her pearls and her earrings in that picture over there. But that wasn't just when they were dressed up. I mean, she was walking around the house in always her best clothes. And mom, look at the Father Knows Best. I don't know. It looks like they're all standing there, all dressed up nicely. And that's what you did in the 1950s. Now that part's pretty realistic in some ways, because if you were going out, like going to a movie, Okay, just to a movie. You would dress up and you would dress up to go to a restaurant because those were not common occurrences. Those were actually treats that you had. So anyway, was it showing anything realistic? No. You're not going to really start to see realistic portrayals coming into television in some ways until the 1970s. Okay, and then you're going to start to see people like Norman Lear and some of the others that are going to, they're going to start to try to address real life situations, problems that everyday families have, and try to solve them. Now, one of the shows that most people don't think of as being controversial is going to start, I think, in 1969, I think is when it started, maybe 68, but the Brady Bunch. The Brady Bunch, oh, that's the story of a big family. Well, it's the story of a mom who had three daughters and a dad who had three sons that married each other. But nobody ever talks about the fact that are you guys divorced? Are you widow and widower? I mean, that was just never, that was the closest they came. And so then you had Mary Tyler Moore. She's going to represent a woman going and living out on her own in the late 60s, early 70s. 1950s, though, you're going to see very few minorities at all and very few realistic anything on those shows. All right, now we've got another election. This is the election of 1952. And you have Adelaide Stevenson, governor of Illinois, running as the Democrat. And then we have Dwight D. Eisenhower running as the Republican nominee. The election of 1952 is, well, this one's not maybe as nasty in some ways as the others that we've talked about occasionally, but Adelaide Stevenson tended to bring out a lot of younger voters, and there was a thought that maybe he was going to win. But Eisenhower, remember, he's much like in some ways General Ulysses S. Grant, and Eisenhower, when he comes out there, the Korean War is going on, and they call him Ike. There was one of his campaign buttons, very famous one, was "I like Ike." So when he's out there campaigning, he says, "I'll go to Korea as soon as I'm elected." So the people who wanted the Korean War to end thought that, hey, he means he's going to go over there, and we're going to call this whole thing off and have, a armistice and end the war, whatever. People that thought, they wanted to continue the war, wanted to continue until we win this war, thought that he meant, I'm going to go over there and take it. So see, it was one of those things, matter of interpretation. But Ike's elected. It was not like Ulysses S. Grant, though. This was a small majority. And his vice president, though, is the guy who made some headlines for the first time, remember, back with HUAC and Alger Hiss and all that. We've got Richard Milhous Nixon. So, as I was saying about the 1950s sitcoms, the TV shows, they're not really reflective of what's really going on. And what's really going on, again, one of the big, big, big deals is the civil rights movement. And we're going to talk a lot about the civil rights movement here. And first, you need to know that President Eisenhower is not a strong supporter of civil rights for African Americans. He's just not. Okay, you can't decode that. But he was committed to enforcing the law. Okay, so that puts him in a position of, he's not going to go out and fight for it, but if it's set in the law, he's not going to go against it either, if that makes sense. Now, his Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren is going to be the head of what we call the Warren Court sometimes. And the Warren Court is known for doing what we call social and judicial activism. Okay, they're going to make some of the most important rulings on civil rights and civil liberties and all sorts of things. And Chief Justice Warren was appointed by Eisenhower. And one of the big ones is the decision that was made in Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, 1954. This is going to be the Supreme Court case that starts integration. It ends segregation. It's gonna overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a huge one. Now the Warren Court, there's other things that the Warren Court, like there's a few other ones that were milestones that they ruled on. There's one called Loving. What was the Loving case? It was Loving v. I want to say West Virginia, but I think it's Virginia. I don't remember. It was Loving versus either Virginia or West Virginia, and that was one of the Warren Court's cases where they ruled that it was legal for an interracial couple to get married. Imagine, okay, and I don't remember that one. I think was 1966 or 67. So imagine, I mean, it's the world that they're living in. And so Earl Warren is going to be right there, trying to push some things forward. And he's going to be, he's going to be a disappointment in some ways to Eisenhower, who had appointed him. But Eisenhower's really not liking the idea of the government coming too much into the private realm. And you kind of feel the old states' rights thing popping its ugly head again. Well, Eisenhower, though, again, is a man of the law. So if they rule it this way, Eisenhower, by golly, is going to support it. So again, hey, the big one is going to be Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now, this is going to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, which in 1896, remember, you had Homer Plessy and the train and all that. And that was where in Plessy versus Ferguson, they said separate but equal is okay. The Brown decision is going to say no, state laws cannot have separate public schools for black and white children. Now, the plaintiffs in the Brown case said that the system of racial separation, it looks separate and equal, but it's not. And we all knew it wasn't. I mean, I wasn't alive then, but I'm saying as a country, I'm sure we knew that, because a lot of times the black children would get the cast off books, the used desk, just things that the white students had already used, and they were buying new ones, and they would get the extras or the leftovers or the used ones. So it allowed them to be treated differently, just ultimately. In the Brown case, the plaintiff, who's named, because there's more, of course, and they usually just take, the first name or whatever. But anyway, the plaintiff that's named is Oliver Brown. He's assistant pastor, and he's a black man. His daughter, Linda, is in third grade, and she's having to walk 6 blocks to her school bus stop to ride a bus to her black school about a mile away. So there was an elementary school, which was 7 blocks from her house. This is kind of ridiculous. So Brown and some other parents tried to attempt at least to get their children enrolled into the closest neighborhood school in 1951. And they were like, no, we're not going to allow your child to come here. The black school's down there. It's over there. So what happens is, goes through the courts, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the key decision here that's important for you to know is that even if segregated black and white schools are equal, which they were not, okay, in facilities and teachers, maybe in teachers sometimes, but definitely not facilities, segregation by itself is harmful to black students and unconstitutional because it causes psychological and social problems due to the separation itself. In other words, separate but equal is inherently unequal, right? So again, you see the Supreme Court change their rulings in different times in history, and that's a good thing. I mean, remember, there were times when the Supreme Court said many different things. And like I mentioned the Loving case earlier, Loving versus Virginia or West Virginia, wherever it was, I'd have to look it up. But if you had polled people in the South in the 1960s before the Loving case and maybe even after it, if you'd polled them and said, hey, is it a good idea, or is interracial marriage a good thing? And they would have probably said no. If you polled people in the South, they probably would have said no. So the thing about the Supreme Court is they have to make the decisions based on their understanding of the law and constitutionality of the law. And sometimes our ideas as a society change. So from Plessy v. Ferguson to, separate but equal is okay, to Brown, where we have separate but equal is inherently unequal, you can see how the court can change over a period of time. So a really big deal in the civil rights movement, of course, is the Montgomery bus boycott. And that's going to happen over a period of about a year. It's a civil rights protest where African Americans refused to ride city buses in Montgomery, Alabama, because of the segregated seating. So it's going to go for about a year, from late 1955 to late 1956. And a few days before the boycott started, Rosa Parks, an African American woman, was arrested because she wouldn't give up her bus seat to a white man. And that was the policy, if the seats filled up. I mean, you were already in the back of the bus if you were a African American at the time. But if the white riders part, the section in the front was full, then the black riders in the back had to get up and give their seat away to the white person. So, it all came about because of, again, Rosa Parks in early December of 1955. She was seated back in the colored section, as they called it. And then the driver asked her to give up her seat along with three other black riders, and because the front half was full, and she said no, and she was arrested. She paid a fine. She had some fees that she had to pay, and it turns out, that this is going to start something a lot bigger. Okay. Now, she's not the first one who refused to give up her seat. There actually was a younger girl in Montgomery who was arrested for doing the same thing a while before Rosa Parks. But the problem with her, whatever was her name, it was a younger girl, and they were prepared to do some kind of protest, but they found out she was pregnant, and I'm assuming she was unmarried because they thought that she wouldn't be the good face for their protests. So anyway, Rosa Parks had actually been active already in the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I mean, she wasn't just some woman off the street. I mean, she was a person who really was already interested in working in civil rights. So the Montgomery boycott comes about, and this is going to be the idea now to test the constitutionality of segregation itself. Can we make black people sit at the back of the bus just because they're black? Can we make black people give up their seats for white people? Now, this is where Martin Luther King, we really start to hear about Martin Luther King Jr. And he's going to support this boycott, and he calls for nonviolent resistance. So it's crazy how determined they were, because there were these women like Rosa Parks, who was a seamstress, but there were these women who refused to ride the buses, and they walked wherever they had to go instead of riding the buses, no matter how tired they were. Now, 1956, the Supreme Court rules that, this is not okay. This is not constitutional. So they strike down the city's segregation. But does that fix everything? Of course not. This is really just the beginning of what's to come in the Civil Rights Act, or Civil Rights Movement, really. So the next big thing is going to be Little Rock, Arkansas. And in 1957, 9 black teenagers were chosen to try to integrate Central High School. We call them the Little Rock Nine. And this is, the High Court has said we need to integrate, stop segregation. Governor of Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, called the Arkansas National Guard to stop these kids from entering the school. Okay, they're high school kids. And he was determined that he was going to exercise his state's rights to keep them from having to, segregate the school or integrate rather the schools and allow black and white students to go to school together. So he felt seriously enough about it. He brought out the National Guard to stop them. Now, Eisenhower, though, remember, Eisenhower is not really that interested in civil rights, but he does want to follow the law. So, man of the law, Eisenhower overrides the governor, and he calls in the 101st Airborne to come in and protect the students. So each student had a soldier to guard him or her, and it was just it was violent, crazy, out of control. You've got Melba Beals, I think her name was Patillo, I have in parentheses at the time, was one of the 9, and she was threatened with being skinned alive. She wrote a book called Warriors Don't Cry. Gloria Ray was pushed down a flight of stairs, and there were so many others. If you go and you look it up, you can read about them. There's so many stories. But they were all barred from participating in extracurricular activities. It's kind of, they just wanted to make it really uncomfortable for them once the federal government had come in and actually enforced the integration law. It doesn't get any better for them for quite a while. Picture of Governor of Arkansas Orville Faubus holding up the sign against racial integration of all schools within the Little Rock School District. That's what he stood for. We've got the Little Rock Nine here on the top left. You can see them. You can see their names if you look closely enough. And these are brave, brave teenagers. And down in the bottom right, you see an Arkansas Democrat story about the armed troops, and then Faubus told the guard to stop. Just all of the stories you can look up. I used to love to go and look through actual old, not actually copies of newspapers, but there were actually some other ways back in the day that you could look at them where they weren't digital. I used to go and love to do that. And I love to go and read old newspapers that are archived online because of the history and stuff. It's just fun for me. But something like this, there's so much documentation, so many different places. Here's another iconic picture. This picture is of Elizabeth Eckford trying to enter, and you've got a girl behind her, and look at them. I mean, to me, I don't know, this is just me, but to me, the people in the old pictures, they always look a lot older than they actually were. Because if you look at the girl on the left with her books and stuff, and then you look at the one right behind Elizabeth Eckford, okay, the one yelling at her, her name is Hazel something, and there's a story to this. I mean, she was yelling at Elizabeth, and they ended up becoming friends, actually. But that girl yelling at her, I thought that was a mom. I mean, she looks at least in her 30s or 40s to me. She was 15, you guys, 15. And then Elizabeth was 15. And I'm not even going to guess at some of the others because to me, as I said, they all look older to me than what they were. But yeah, that picture became iconic and also had an extra added layer because they did become friends afterwards. We're getting very close to the end of this. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. But we need to talk a little bit about Virginia Foster Durr. And she was a civil rights activist, a supporter of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was actually, it was popularly called SNCC, S-N-C-C. And this was a group in colleges a lot of times for younger Black people to get involved. And you had both black and white activists working together for civil rights. And Virginia Foster Durr and her husband were very involved in civil rights. Now, she became friends with Rosa Parks. And in December of 1955, Virginia and I believe her husband, I think his name was Clifford, and some others bailed out Rosa Parks when she was actually sent to jail, arrested and all that. They were there to bail her out after she refused to give up her bus seat. And then Virginia and her husband, along with the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, okay, helped Rosa Parks bring her case all the way to the Supreme Court, which again was vital to challenging the idea of, is segregation legal at any level? Here's another thing from an old newspaper. This is from 1976, much later. And I guess at the time, if you read it, it says she was 72, I guess, at that time. But they talk about how she's devoted a lot of her life to the civil rights movement and all sorts of things. So, I mean, she's going to be very well known and plays a very important role. You don't hear a lot about her, but I'd like you to know about her as far as studying for your exam. I know that you need to know about her because she usually doesn't get noticed at all, and she did a lot of behind the scenes work. Now we've got to talk about one of the worst stories that always makes me emotional every single time, just like when I talk about the Nazis and stuff. This one makes me very emotional every time I hear the story, tell the story, or anything about this story really bothers me. So you have a little boy, Emmett Till, who's from Chicago, and he goes down for the summer to spend time with some of his family. And his mom warned him before he went down there. She said, "Look, it's different in the South. You have to you have to act differently if you're a black boy in the South." Well, he was accused of flirting, according to some, talking to, according to some, winking, according to some, saying, "Hey, baby," or whistling at her. I don't know what happened. Well, actually, I'll tell you before it's over what really happened. But he was accused of somehow doing something to kind of flirt with, or whatever, a married white woman who was working in a grocery store. And her husband heard about that, and he went over to where the little boy was staying with family. And he and his half brother, J.W. Milan, Roy Bryant was Carolyn Bryant's husband, obviously, and then his half brother is Milan. But they went over and they pulled out this little boy, 14 years old, and they beat him to death. It was beyond horrible what they did to him. And if you want, you can go read about it. You can look up the Emmett Till case and see what they did as far as details. But it was so bad that his mom insisted that they keep the casket open because his face is barely recognizable as human. It was just, it was, it was terrible. She wanted people to see. She wanted people to know how dangerous it was for black people in the South. Okay. And what happens to the murderers? Well, that's part of the case that really gets Emmett Till even more of a prominent spot when we talk about him in history, because these guys were tried in the South and they were acquitted. Huh. Interesting, right? Because the rest of the story is those guys who killed the little boy, actually, after they were found not guilty, they went and sold their story to a magazine. And they told the magazine all about how they killed him. Yeah, they couldn't be put on trial again Do you know why? If we were in class, I would say, do you know why they couldn't be put on trial? They literally just admitted it to the world in a magazine. Look, here's what we did. Well, double jeopardy. You can't be tried twice for the same crime, even if you confess to it in front of the whole world and give details. Ridiculous, right? Now, I have to warn you, I mean, I probably would anyway, but in the days of trigger warnings and everything else, I mean, the next slide is very difficult because what it's going to show is the open casket, you know, the way his face is going to look, and it's going to be right there with the picture that I've got that was taken of him right here on this slide in Christmas of the year before he was killed. And you're going to see the contrast of what they did to this little boy. Now, before you watch the next slide, I also want to tell you that Carolyn Bryant eventually admitted, and she just died recently. She just died recently, within the past year. I don't remember when. She died recently. But you know, this woman admitted before she died at some point that he had never said anything or done anything disrespectful. He hadn't done anything to her. Now, she also admitted that her husband, Roy, was abusive, and apparently she was scared of him. Well, I mean, of course she should be scared of him. Of course he's abusive. He's going into people's houses at night, ripping out a 14-year-old and killing him to the point where he's beyond recognition. So whatever happened there, why that story was told, why all of this, you can look all that up. I just want you to know the basics, that this is what this becomes a sign of where we are still in the 1950s to push the civil rights movement forward. Now, again, before you see the next slide, beware, because he's barely recognizable as a human face. Here's some pictures of the civil rights movement. You know, you see Dr. Martin Luther King over here and over there. You see a really good front-on picture of him on the top right, I believe. And then there's Rosa Parks down there on the bottom in the, I guess, in the middle. She's the second woman from the left in the bottom right picture. So many other things happened during the civil rights movement that we don't talk about, or we don't have time to talk about all of them. I took a class in graduate school called the Civil Rights Movement, and we had time to talk about all of it, and that was pretty amazing because there's so much more to it. But just to give you just little glimpses is what I'm trying to do here. And up at the top, you have students holding a sit-in at a lunch counter because the lunch counters and a lot of restaurants and stuff were still segregated, so they didn't allow black folks in. And so a lot of times they would stage a sit-in. This was a peaceful means of protest, and you would sit there even though they wouldn't serve you. You would sit there, okay? And you have the Freedom Riders, and the Freedom Riders, that got pretty dangerous for some of the Freedom Riders, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to end the segregation on the buses, okay? So the Freedom Riders, see, at that time, 1960, 1961, we're going to see that African Americans were still treated badly on buses, for example, interstate buses were still segregated. And again, you've got segregation in places like hospital waiting rooms, separate restrooms for interstate passengers. I mean, there's all sorts of things that had been ridden, some of them by the Supreme Court by this time, but it's just not, it takes a while, right? Before things happen that even though the Supreme Court rules on them, sometimes it takes a while just because you have people like Orville Faubus blocking integration and all sorts of stuff. So the Freedom Riders were necessary. Now, 1960, 1961, just as we've got John Kennedy getting elected and then entering the White House, we're going to see that there were volunteer freedom riders that are going to leave from places like Washington, D.C., and they're going to go into the South. And they got training, and it was interracial groups. And they decided, what their intent was, again, was to integrate the buses and trains and interstate travel and the restaurants and waiting rooms and all that's tied to it, is everything they could. So anyway, they were in interracial groups. So they would sit wherever they wanted on the buses and trains, right? And again, it got dangerous at some points. So the further they got south, it got a little bit more violent. Okay. So when they got down to Birmingham, or Birmingham, Alabama, rather, of course, the police got violent with them, and they decided that they were going to call the KKK out on these freedom riders. Now, what happens is a mob of KKK terrorists attack one of the buses that carries the freedom riders. They slash the tires and they firebomb the other bus. Wow, right? They're going to hold the front bus door shut, and the front bus of the bus that got firebombed, hoping to burn the riders to death. Now, they were somehow able to get out of there, but after they got out, they were viciously, just like brutally beaten. And then you have the highway patrolmen that appear finally, and they kind of stop the riders from being killed. Well, some of them ended up in the hospital, of course, because of that. And the second bus that had gone on, when it made a stop at some point, it was going to be attacked by some KKK terrorists who beat these guys again, black and white, and the bus kept going. Okay. This is amazing to me that they kept going. And they ended up in Birmingham, and they were attacked again. This time you had a bunch of people with baseball bats and bicycle chains and all sorts of stuff going on. Now, John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby, was Attorney General, and he was told about the burning and the violence that was going on in the South. And he told them to try to, maybe not do this for a while. Let's just not do this. The Freedom Riders went on. They went to Montgomery. Another mob was waiting, and the bus drivers at that point, though, decided, we're not going to go any further. So again, there's a lot of violence. There's more times where the SNCC members, remember those, the college students generally, they decided to continue the freedom ride that had stopped somewhere that, where they weren't allowed to continue. So we have about 10 new guys, that get on the bus, and they go from Nashville to Birmingham, and they're arrested, put in jail. And anyway, it's again, you're going to have a scene that later that night, some of the SNCC members are going to get on a bus, head toward Montgomery. The Alabama Highway Patrol is actually driving with them, which is kind of surprising to me. I don't know. But when the Highway Patrol left, they got beaten, and the ambulances, well, they, again, I get emotional with this stuff too. I'm sorry. I mean, I can't stand this stuff. But the ambulances, people call the ambulances, but the ambulances refused to take these people who had been beaten almost to death to the hospital. And so these freedom riders were rescued by local black men and women who came out. Now, then later that night, a bunch of white supremacist terrorists surrounded a black church in Montgomery. And the reason they picked this particular church is because the freedom riders and local black folks were holding a meeting, and local, black, not just black folks, but also white supporters were holding a meeting. The mob starts to attack the church. Okay, the church. They start to attack the, church. And Dr. Martin Luther King really, this is a big appearance of Dr. King. And he's going to respond with prayer. Okay. Now, he attempted to just talk to the white mob, but they threw bricks at him. Surprised he didn't get killed at that moment. But anyway, he went back into the church, and, so they continue on. There's more freedom rides, and, there's really, you're not seeing any enforcement really in the Deep South, especially of the Supreme Court and their view of African American rights. So it's a mess, and there's been movies made about the Freedom Riders. There's been a lot of things that have been written about the Freedom Riders, and these are very brave people, because I have no idea. Well, I'll just say it. I probably couldn't have done that, because I would have been extraordinarily scared, especially after the first time someone got beaten. But 3 years after the first Freedom Ride, the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed and signed by President Lyndon Johnson, which outlawed segregation in all public facilities in all parts of the United States. Okay, so that was it. Now, did that mean that after 1964 everything was just great? No, of course it didn't. But civil rights movement continued on, and in my opinion still continues to this day in some ways. So when did the civil rights movement end? Well, like I just said, I still think we're still having reverberations from that. I don't think that this country is racially completely healed from the Civil War, and the things that went on before the Civil War and Reconstruction and everything else has led up to where we are today. But if you want to look at a time where we can say that the Civil War, or I'm sorry, that the Civil Rights Movement, the active, working for rights, for equal rights for black men and women. Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination, a lot of people say, is kind of the end. I mean, we had another big leader, Malcolm X, who had been assassinated before that. He was not an advocate of the peaceful protest like Dr. King. But Dr. King, when he gets assassinated in 1968 in April, this is, again, this is sometimes what we consider to be almost the end of the movement. It's almost like it sucked the passion out of it, because he was a de facto leader. So, excuse me, he was killed by a guy while he was standing on a balcony at a motel in Tennessee. I think it was Memphis. And he had been out doing a nonviolent demonstration, and he was shot by, I think it was with James Earl Ray. I think a lot of these assassins have three names they end up going by in the press anyway. So I think it was James Earl Ray. But there's going to be riots after his murder. Okay, this peaceful man is going to be murdered, and there's going to be riots across the country. And we are going to see the passing of the Fair Housing Act. Now, that's going to be passed a few days after Dr. King was murdered. And Congress, I think, felt like they needed to press this and pass it in his memory. So if you were a owner of a household, if you were a landlord, if you were leasing business property, or if you were trying to sell property of any kind, you were now committing a crime if you refused to rent, sell, or provide any kind of financing based on anything other than the individual's finances. In other words, color, okay, race. So, again, was it the end of the civil rights movement? I mean, they're going to try to continue on a little bit, but as I said, I mean, their heart and soul has gone with Dr. King and the murder. And the fact that it was his nonviolent protest and his asking for interracial cooperation and all of that, and his peace that he kept asking for, the fact that he got murdered was something that, again, just kind of marks the change and the end of the real consistent fight for rights that had gone on since the 50s. That's where your last exam ends. So that's it, guys.